I think what's challenging in this moment is that if we're trying to oppose these changes to our democracy, we need to both make it obvious that they're happening, which means the importance of denouncing them. But we also need to give voice to the deep-seated unhappiness that so many people are feeling with the existing system. And most of our politicians have not spent a lot of time thinking about the next system.
Welcome to Making Peace Visible, the podcast focused on peace, conflict, and the media. I'm your host, Jamil Simon. If you're one of our regular listeners, you might have noticed our episodes have been sporadic lately. That's because we're working on something special, a limited series focused on polarization in the United States, what it costs us, and how Americans are working to decrease polarization and solve shared problems in different sectors of society. We're calling the series Beyond Polarization. It's scheduled to start in July to give us time to recruit insightful guests with diverse points of view. In the meantime, we're featuring past interviews and conversations from some of our other favorite podcasts that connect to the topic of polarization. In this episode, we're featuring Suzette Brooks Masters, a political strategist, a thought leader, and a senior fellow at the Democracy Funders Network. Masters believes that for American democracy to thrive, it's not enough to defend existing systems against attack. It's time for new ideas and frameworks that engage citizens in the practice of democracy. And she says government could learn a few things from the world of science fiction. We first published this interview in May 2025. Suzette, welcome to Making Peace Visible. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Suzette, you're the co-author of a fascinating report called Imagining Better Futures for American Democracy. In the process of researching the report, you talked to a wide range of visionaries, activists, practitioners about what might be possible for American democracy. Could you say a little more about the Imagining Better Futures for Democracy project, how it came about, how it unfolded, how it's been used?
I would love to. It's one of the things I'm actually proudest of. So the project began in 2022, and that was about a year after the January 6th insurrection. And that insurrection was a pivotal moment for me because I realized that even though Biden had won the election, there was still a lot of turmoil and contestation going on, and there was still a lot of unhappiness with our system. And most of the work that I'd been involved in since 2016 had been on shoring up our democracy and trying to figure out how to defend it. And then after the insurrection happened, it became clear that those efforts had been insufficient and that a purely defensive posture wasn't going to get us across the finish line. So that's when I started thinking about what else we could be doing to strengthen democracy, to give it more energy and dynamism so people appreciated it, weren't taking it for granted. And so I started wondering who was thinking around the corner and looking at how we might do things better. I looked for those visionaries in a variety of fields. I discovered an entire ecosystem of people that were operating more at the margins, at the fringe of what was possible. They were able to imagine how things could be different, which is a very different sensibility than saying, I'm feeling under threat. I just want to respond to the threat. So I interviewed a whole bunch of them, over 80. And while there were some hopeful findings, there were some very stressful findings, like the fact that most people weren't really thinking about our governance systems as capable of moving us towards the better futures that they had imagined. They were either thinking completely independently of our system, or they were thinking about reimagining the system entirely. But it was hard to map how we are today to how, to the place we want to get in the future. So I think I'll stop there unless you want to go a little deeper.
I was curious if you had some inspiring conversations that in that process that help you see things in new ways.
Yeah. So there were a couple of takeaways. one of the hugest takeaways was that this was an incredibly diverse group of people. And yet, if you ask them about their preferred futures, what they're imagining, there was tremendous synergy and overlap in what people wanted. Most people want, a planet where they can thrive, where their kids and grandkids can thrive. They want opportunity. They want a chance to be who they are. And they want to be free from constraint, right? And not having other people tell them who they need to be or what path they need to follow. So, there's a lot that crosses ideology around freedom, around thriving, around abundance.
I mean, Americans at this point find themselves in a kind of predicament. There are two sides, the right and the left, and each side says it's standing up for democracy and that the other side is trying to destroy democracy. They both can't be right, obviously. So how do you deal with that dichotomy there?
I think that is one of the most troubling problems that we're facing right now, is that in some ways we're in a post-truth world where people can be convinced of all sorts of things that might be in seeming contradiction, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. And so one of the big ahas that I had was that it seemed so clear to me what democracy meant. I thought those were widely shared views, and therefore that the authoritarians would acknowledge that they were, in fact, authoritarians. But when the authoritarians are able to actually claim the mantle of democracy as the impetus for their work, I mean, that is just a wild situation. And I think that's where we are today. You opened by saying that, there were attacks on the rule of law and due process, people being disappeared, being deported without any kind of process. And I think as we move towards what this means in the real world for real people, even if there's a mantle of we're defending democracy, right? I think it's going to become pretty clear in the practice that these are not the norms and the expectations that we have living in the United States. So I have a faint glimmer of hope that the contradiction is going to become too large to ignore, and that the two sides will no longer be mirror images of one another.
Most people listening to this would venture to guess that the attack on democracy is coming from the Republicans. Do you think you could explain the opposite perspective from what you learned? The argument that the left is a threat to democracy?
Yeah. So I think if we go back to those principles of freedom to be who you are and the upholding of norms, I think what the left failed to appreciate is how much change has taken place in recent decades and how threatening that is to many, many people. And then the imperiousness, honestly, the orthodoxy around having to adopt those other viewpoints or being canceled, I think was a weakness, frankly, that ended up being very uncharitable and lacking in empathy for how difficult it is for certain people to accept change that challenges their fundamental values or experiences. And I think the left really humiliated people who weren't comfortable. They made them feel like they were lesser, that they were horrible people. I mean, a lot of labels were ascribed to people who were uncomfortable that I think really escalated the culture wars. And so I do think that there is a perception among people who are not, quote unquote, woke, that wokeism was in fact an orthodoxy that was being imposed upon them. And I think a lot of these anti-DEI efforts that we're seeing now are an overcorrection. But I think both suffer from the fact that they're orthodoxies. And, I think pluralism is at the heart of a successful democracy, which is you live and you let live. You respect people with differences. You understand that everyone comes to their views however they come to their views. There's always a story, experiences, the way you were raised. I mean, it doesn't come out of thin air, right?
Everyone does have a story. And I mean, if you were in charge, what would be your rallying cry?
I think what's challenging in this moment and I don't have all the answers, is that we need, if we're trying to oppose these changes to our democracy, we need to both make it obvious that they're happening, which means the importance of denouncing them. But we also need to give voice to the deep-seated unhappiness that so many people are feeling with the existing system. And most of our politicians have not spent a lot of time thinking about the next system, which gets back to the beginning of our conversation. Most of us have been making do with a suboptimal system. So paradoxically, the Democrats, who had been the party of change for a long time, they've become the status quo party, defending this current system, which is extremely imperfect and is not working well for most people. So part of why that was rejected was that people want something else that works better for them. They don't feel that democracy is actually delivering. So it puts the opposition party now in a conundrum, because you still want to defend the fundamentals of our democratic system, but it has not been well implemented. And so the practice of democracy in the US is poor.
Do you think more bridge building would help the cause of democracy?
That is a great question, because bridge building barely even existed in this country until Trump was elected the first time. And then a whole ecosystem arose, primarily from, the peace building world abroad being brought to the US, which was now seen as a conflict zone, right? And we had these huge ideological divisions, affective polarization, which we really hadn't had in this country at this level of intensity. And so people were striving to figure out how to fix that. And so I think the impulse was to bring different people together, get them to see each other as people, and somehow everything was going to be okay because, your neighbor with the MAGA hat, was a great guy. And so everything was going to be fine. And I think we have a lot more data now and evidence about what works and what doesn't work. And I would say classic conversational bridge building is not effective. What is effective is doing things together with diverse people where you have a shared purpose and you're actually engaging in an activity for the benefit of the community, right? Conversation is not enough. We live in an environment where our social media, where so many people spend so much time, is constantly pulling people apart. And so what you're trying to do with these bridge building efforts is to, in the real world, cement the view that diversity is healthy, that you can work with people with very different points of view. But then when you go back to your individual life, you're back in that echo chamber that's pulling you towards the poles.
Do you see a relationship between peace and democracy? I mean, they certainly can reinforce each other, I think. But what kinds of things can you see where peace efforts or peace practices can help in improving our democracy?
Well, I do think they have a lot in common. I think at the end of the day, to have a sustained peace and to have a strong, sustainable democracy, you need respect. You need a diversity of views that are respected as legitimate. You need to not humiliate people who don't disagree with you. And I think you need to have norms of behavior that enshrine that respect. So that means no violence, no humiliation, no specific targeting because of people's views or characteristics. I think there's a difference in perhaps the institutions that have more or less importance, depending on whether you're taking a peace frame or a, democratic governance frame. But at the end of the day, I think it's all about pluralism.
I mean, also there's some activities that are in common, like dialogue and negotiation and, civic participation. The idea that you mentioned earlier about people not just participating in the elections every 2 years, but getting involved in local and regional governance outside of elections, town halls and paying attention to what your congressmen or your mayors and others are doing.
Right. But the challenge there, I think it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg. When people are disgruntled and disenchanted with the system, they tend to opt out. So they either are in a tear everything down mode or I'm going to sit on the couch mode, right? And what you're talking about requires some willingness to engage, which requires some faith that the system is worth engaging with. And I think the challenge that we're having now is how to turn that around in the United States. Because frankly, most town halls are horrible. Most public meetings are formulaic. It's one side versus another, either in a NIMBY process or some dispute. None of our settings are conducive to that kind of deliberation and dialogue. So I think for that to happen at scale in the US, we need to transform the way we think about these processes as ways to bring people together, not just to get through some requirement under state law that you have to have a meeting. We need to use all of these tools to solve our civic engagement problem. And that means we need to change it so that they're meetings people actually want to go to and feel like they can have constructive time with their neighbors and with their politicians or their representatives.
In the article that you wrote, Making Lemonade Out of Lemons, you talked about some of the innovations that you think show promise. Can you talk about a few of those that you think have particular promise?
I'm very intrigued by different forms of deliberative democracy as a way to solve some of the problems we've been talking about. The problem is they tend to not engage that many people as a percentage of the population. But I think as a model that could eventually be replicated and scaled, perhaps using technology, they have a lot of promise. They show how diverse people can come together. People who don't know each other at all come together for a specific amount of time to solve a problem that perhaps their politicians haven't been able to solve, or a problem in their community, or a vision for where they want their community to be heading in the decades ahead. So there are a number of projects like this that have mostly taken place outside the US. Citizens' assemblies are these wonderful gatherings that have been used extensively in Europe and in other parts of the world to bring a representative sample of people together with access to resources and expertise and mediation and negotiation to give the quote unquote community view of how a particular problem should be solved. And I think those have been done even on some very contentious issues. So this is starting to take root in the US now. There have been a few citizens' assemblies, mostly in the West and mostly on, I would say, land use issues more broadly. If you have all of a sudden some public land and, what should you do with it, right? What does the community want to do with it? We haven't used it that much for contentious issues, although that is starting to change. In Oregon recently, they had a citizens' assembly on how to solve youth homelessness in Bend, Oregon, or Deschutes County, Oregon. There are efforts bubbling up in other parts of the country, mostly at the local level, I would say at the city or town level. The rub is that most of these assemblies don't have that many people in them. They have usually between 20 and 50 people. And so it doesn't spread to others unless those people talk it up, unless there's a lot of publicity and promotion, and that there's a concrete outcome that can then be spoken about in the press. And people say, oh, wow, that process with my neighbors led to some new piece of legislation or a shift in policy. And then you can start hearing that story as one of efficacy, right? So I'm bullish on citizens' assemblies. A similar thing is participatory budgeting, which also has been used, I would say, more effectively outside the US because they've allocated much larger sums of money to be shaped by the public. So a bunch of people get together and they deliberate on how a part of the budget should be spent on what are the priorities. So you're not just dealing with a random public policy issue, you're actually shaping perhaps the budgetary priorities of your city. And one of the things I'm very interested in is how we can get communities to think longer term about the future of their communities or the future of their country. And that's been done in some places, like in Japan, in Wales, where you have a structured way, you do a visioning process, and then the government goes out to lots of parts of the country and asks people what they think. What do they want? And we have not done that in the United States. We have not gone around and asked people, what do you want? I live in New York City. What do you want New York City to look like in 2060? And then how are you going to operationalize that, right?
We focus a lot on stories because we talk to a lot of journalists and other people who are writing about these issues. And you could say that everything boils down to stories, stories we're told and stories we tell ourselves. There are a lot of negative stories circulating around in our media ecosystem that provoke and reinforce negativity and divisiveness. So we've talked a little bit about where we look for visions of the future, kind of a positive, abundant, cooperative visions. How do we integrate them, in a sense, to our political system or our democratic system?
Well, my dream, if I could just snap my fingers and make something happen, would be to use all the powerful technology that we have around world building and, all of the cinematographic skills that we have to paint different worlds and make our candidates for office really compete for which vision of the future is the one that the electorate should be voting for, and then help people immerse themselves in that future so they can make a legitimate decision about what world they want to inhabit. We are very close to having the technology to be able at scale to have people experience different possible futures. And I think that would be fascinating. So that's one way to get a different kind of story. I think the other thing is, I think there's a big role for science fiction writers and speculative fiction writers to depict better futures. I don't know if you're familiar with the book by Kim Stanley Robinson, Ministry of the Future, but it depicted a future where the climate crisis was solved. Not easily. A lot of bumps, a lot of hard things happened and decisions had to be made, but it charted a possible path to deal with all the dystopia that we're surrounded by. And that kind of literary genre is called solar punk or cyberpunk. It's not La La Land, right? It's not pure utopia, but it helps you imagine how things could change in such a way that you could actually solve these problems. And I think we need a lot more of that, as opposed to the kind of cultural content that we get where you either have a rogue individual fighting every single government imaginable because it's all corrupt, right? Or you have the end of the world as we know it, and we're kind of in a Lord of the Flies, awful situation. These are not futures that are going to inspire people to be creative.
What types of media storytelling should be supported and encouraged? People talk about narratives, since the narratives we share as a society describe the current paradigm. We need to change the narrative in order to change the paradigm.
I actually really believe that we have to look more at the local level for demonstration projects because everyone lives somewhere. Yes, we all technically live in the United States, but we live in specific places. And our sense of reality in those places is much more tethered to fact because it's what we're surrounded by. And so we're observing these things in real life. And I think that's where there's the greatest potential upside if we can get people to trust their institutions, to work constructively with their neighbors, So I would say that the local level is very tangible and where there's relatively more trust in institutions. That the higher up you go, the less trust there is. And I also think it's easier to experiment at the local level.
Absolutely.
I think what's more challenging is as a citizen to know what's happening where so that people can make choices about, well, I really like what they're doing in this place. I think I'll move there. But most people, they have no way of capturing that essence. You don't get to consume that content about, Vermont's digital platform or Fort Collins's Committee of the Future or Bend, Oregon's Citizens Assembly, right? Like it's hard in such a big country with so many governments at so many levels to figure out what you want and how to change the one that you have. But I do think that's very likely where, the most successful experiments are going to take place.
And it's possible that this very difficult, challenging period that we're going through right now with the attacks on democracy, that, it could end up being like what Joni Mitchell says, you don't really know what you've got till you lose it. And we're in the process of losing it. And so maybe this might wake people up, might provoke a new way of thinking about democracy. You talk a lot about, and we've been talking about, future thinking and future design, and what it looks like, getting people to imagine different ways of doing things. But the future community rarely connects with the democracy community. How can we bring those people together, or those ideas together?
Yeah, that is a very difficult problem. I think so much of government now is really designed to solve problems in the present, because the incentives don't exist in our system that reward people that are looking around the corner or that are willing to take risk. And so I feel like bureaucracy and government in this country has become stodgy, has become routinized. Being creative is rarely at the top of the list of what you want out of your personnel. I'm making gross generalizations here, but I think bureaucracy has laws of its own that swallow up creativity because it's difficult to swim upstream. It's difficult to buck a system that's so embedded. And so I think over time, that's made it even harder, even when people are willing to engage in creative thinking, to try new things. It's often very difficult to move the ship. So I think what we need really is a fundamental organizational shift that will lead to incentive shifts.
That's very important.
That reward people saying everything right now is shifting. We are in a period of transformational change. What's coming next may look nothing like what we've experienced in the past, and we need to be ready to take that on. And we need to be more adaptive, more flexible, less certain that we have all the answers. I call it holding assumptions lightly.
I like that
We
phrase.
are so convinced that we know what's happening next. We just assume that it's going to be like it's always been. And unless you're willing to let go of that and say, you know what, I really don't know. I really don't know what's going to happen. And therefore, I need to be prepared for lots of different possibilities. And that means I can't be as certain of anything. And I really believe that if you can embrace that view, you will do better at navigating all of this disruption.
I think so. And that's a great place to end it. Is there anything I didn't ask that you think is worth adding to our discussion?
I think what would be wonderful is if more of our institutions were able to really think about what I just said. And I don't know how one reaches institutions in civil society at scale, but this need to accept that we're in an era of transformation is the central point, I think. Everything else flows from that. The reason democracy is so unstable is in part because it's been unable to really adapt well to all of the transformation that we're having. So you get this populist backlash that either says we need an autocrat to solve our problems because it's too chaotic, or to say, I want to go back to a time when I understood the world, when I wasn't so scared of everything, when everything wasn't changing. So unless we can demonstrate that our institutions can take us to the future responsibly, we're going to keep having to deal with this populist backlash because people are scared and they don't feel like anyone has their back, that anyone knows what's going on or can solve the problems.
Right.
So
And they have a right to be scared. I mean,
absolutely.
it is really a difficult situation we've created for ourselves. Suzette, thank you. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I really appreciate your insights and all that you bring to this discussion. It's really rich, and I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Suzette Brooks Masters writes about democracy and futures thinking at thefulcrum.us. We have links to her 2 most recent reports for the Democracy Funders Network in the show notes. Making Peace Visible is produced by Andrea Maraskin. The associate producer is Faith McClure, and I'm Jamil Simon. If you find this podcast meaningful, please help us keep it going with a tax-deductible donation. Visit makingpeacevisible.org/donate or show your support by leaving a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening. Thank you for listening, and talk soon.